The first question that we have to answer is, how do we heat up? And the answer to that question is we heat up two ways. We heat up from the outside, meaning the things that we come into contact with, the clothing that we put on our body, whether or not there's heat in the room or whether or not it's cold outside or cold in a room. And we heat up from the inside. Our body has the capacity to generate more heat or to cool down, meaning to turn off the heating process. And it can do that in ways that match the external environment. The simplest way to think about this is that we actually have two body temperatures. People will say, oh, what's body temperature? 98.6. That's actually not true. Body temperature varies between individuals. It varies across time of day within individuals. And at every point across your entire lifespan, you have two distinct temperatures. One is the temperature on your skin, what scientists call your shell, and the temperature of your core, your viscera, meaning your organs, your nervous system, and your spinal cord. And as you can imagine, the temperature of your core is always higher than the temperature at your surface. So the important thing to know is that you have a temperature at your shell and a temperature at your core. Now, you don't need to know exactly what those temperatures are in most cases, but it is vitally important to understand that you have those two temperatures and that your brain is constantly sending out signals to your body as to whether or not it should heat up or cool down depending on the temperature of the shell. Your brain has neurons that send signals to other cells in your body and deploy the release of chemicals in your brain and body to heat you up when you are too cold and to cool you down when you are too hot. If I were to throw a cold towel, ice cold towel onto your torso right now and ask you, well, how do you feel? You'd say, oh, that's cold, that's chilly. However, because your brain is acting like a bit of a thermostat, as the surface, the shell of your body felt cool, it would make sense that that thermostat would activate biological mechanisms that would heat up your core. Similarly, if I were to put you into a very hot environment, you'd say, oh, wow, it's really, really warm in here, but your brain and your body would go through a lot of effort to activate mechanisms to cool you down. So anytime we're talking about heat, meaning deliberate heat exposure, things like sauna, it's very important to understand not just the stimulus, how hot something is, how long you're in a sauna, etc., but the effect that has on your shell and on your core. If you can understand that, you can design protocols that are literally perfect for your goals. And as a final point about this, if you want to develop the best tools leveraging heat for your biology and health and performance, you want to understand heat as a process, as a verb, as heating, not just heat. Because there's the temperature that you are at before you encounter the heat stimulus, before you get in the sauna, for instance, during the heat stimulus, so while you're in the sauna, and then afterward. Everything in biology is a process. So as you'll soon learn, there is a specific sauna protocol that can allow anybody, in fact, to increase the amount of growth hormone released into their brain and body 16-fold. That's right, 16-fold. However, it involves shifting from a hot environment to a cool environment, to a hot environment, to a cool environment over and over and over again over a very short period of time. There's a very basic circuit, meaning neurons that exist in the skin, in the brain, and in the body that communicate with one another that allow you to heat up if you need to and cool down if you need to. You have this shell, which is basically skin, and within the skin you have neurons, nerve cells. Those nerve cells have channels or receptors on them. They're called trip channels. There are some other ones as well, which basically sense changes in heat. So if I were to put a hot object on your hand or your arm, those neurons would respond to that. They would send electrical signals into your spinal cord. And that's where the next station of this circuit resides. In your spinal cord, you've got a little cluster of neurons that exists at the top part of your spinal cord, called the dorsal horn. The name again doesn't matter. And those neurons specifically relay heat information up to another area of your brain. Now here's where we get into some fancy names. It's the lateral parabrachial area. You don't need to know lateral parabrachial area, but it's a relay station. The lateral parabrachial area sends electrical signals to the POA. And I would like you to know POA. The POA stands for preoptic area. Neurons in the preoptic area basically reside over the roof of your mouth. These are neurons within the hypothalamus. And neurons in the preoptic area have the ability to send signals out to the rest of your brain and body to get you to heat up and actually to change your behavior so that you heat up. Your POA, your preoptic area, will actually change the way that you think and feel immediately. For instance, something warm contacts your skin or something very hot contacts your skin. The preoptic area will send signals out to the endothelial cells, the blood vessels, both of the brain and body, that get them to dilate, right? To essentially increase their volume and their surface area in order to cast off heat. You will also start sweating. That sweating response is initiated not by the hot day or the hot sun, but by the preoptic area neurons that send signals out to what's called the periphery of your body, and other chemicals are released, things like acetylcholine, that get you to sweat. If you happen to be shivering, neurons in the preoptic area will make sure that you stop shivering. You're probably familiar with the feeling of being somewhat lethargic or spreading out your limbs on a hot day. Well, that is the result of neurons in your preoptic area impacting your musculature to get you to increase your surface area so you can sweat off or release more heat. You can't just make yourself sweat on demand. Maybe you can through a set of stressful thoughts, but you can't just make yourself sweat. That is autonomic. It's below your conscious control. Things like vasodilation, the dilation of your veins in particular and capillaries in particular. And of course, there are these behavioral, somewhat voluntary aspects of dumping heat. And the lethargy, the kind of tiredness that we feel on a really hot day, that's also controlled by this circuit that I just described. If we're warm enough, we feel active and like we want to move around. If we're too warm, we feel like we need to stay put and spread out our limbs and dump heat. Preoptic area also can send electrical signals to the amygdala, a brain area that is often talked about in the context of fear, but is really just a brain area that can activate your sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is part of your autonomic nervous system and is the one associated with fight or flight or with the stress response or even just the excited response, right? The sympathetic nervous system is also what gets activated when you're really excited about something. It tends to do that when you are suddenly in an environment that feels too hot, that you feel is risky levels of hot. If you ever have gotten into a sauna that was very, very hot, maybe 210 degrees Fahrenheit, you sit there for a minute, you'll notice that your heart rate increases. You often will feel the impulse to get out, especially if you stay in there for a little while. That impulse is the consequence of this preoptic area communicating with your amygdala saying, hey, this environment is really hot and I'm trying to cool down and it's not really working. Now, later we'll talk about the advantage of pushing yourself a little bit through some of these very hot environments, provided you can do it safely. But the impulse to get yourself out of a very hot environment is the consequence of the POA communicating with your amygdala. And the amygdala then in turn activating your adrenal glands, which sit right above your kidneys, the release of adrenaline, and this feeling of agitation like you want to move. Usually you want to move out of whatever hot environment you happen to be in. The use of deliberate heat exposure can be a very powerful way to improve health and longevity. There's a wonderful study on this that was published in 2018 that includes a lot of data from a lot of participants in a lot of different conditions. For instance, people that only did sauna once versus 2 to 3 times a week versus 4 to 7 times a week and so on, and compares all those. The title of the study is Sauna Bathing is Associated with Reduced Cardiovascular Mortality and Improves Risk Prediction in Men and Women. They looked at a sample of 1,688 participants who had a mean age of 63, but there was a range of ages around 63, and of whom 51.4% were women, the rest were men. So it's a pretty nicely varied study in terms of the populations that they looked at. And basically what they found was the more often that people do sauna, the better their health is and the lower the likelihood they will die from some sort of cardiovascular event. The temperature ranges that were used in this study, and pretty much all the studies that I'm going to talk about, unless I say otherwise, are between 80 degrees Celsius, meaning 176 degrees Fahrenheit, and 100 degrees Celsius, meaning 212 degrees Fahrenheit. So somewhere in that range. Now, how long were people exposing themselves to these hot environments? Anywhere from 5 to 20 minutes per session. Very brief periods of just 5 minutes of heat exposure can be a powerful stimulus if the heat exposure is significantly great enough for you. 20 minutes can also be beneficial. What they observed was that people who went into the sauna 2 or 3 times per week were 27% less likely to die of a cardiovascular event than people that went into the sauna just once a week. And in fact, the benefits were even greater for people that were going into the sauna 4 to 7 times per week. Those people were 50% less likely to die of a cardiovascular event compared to people that went into the sauna just once a week. They looked at a number of potentially confounding variables, things like whether or not people smoked, things like whether or not people were overweight, whether or not they tended to exercise or not exercise, and they were able to separate out those variables. So the percentages that I described earlier, 27% less likely to die of a cardiovascular event for those that went in the sauna 2 to 3 times a week, and 50% less likely to die of a cardiovascular event for those that went into the sauna 4 times per week as compared to just once a week. Those effects really do seem to be the consequence of the sauna exposure and not some other effect that's correlated with sauna exposure, like going to the gym where people are working out 7 times a week and then also happen to get into the sauna, or quitting smoking right about the same time they adopt a sauna protocol, these sorts of things. And in every case, regular exposure to sauna, starting at about 2 or 3 times per week, all the way up to 7 times per week, greatly improves, meaning statistically significant improvements in longevity in the sense that people are less likely to die of cardiovascular events and other things that kill us. You don't have to use a sauna in order to get these benefits. It is simply a matter of making sure that your shell and your core heat up properly a bit. Not too much, not too little, but that you heat those up. And no, you do not need to carry a thermometer around or place a thermometer into your core. So the question is, how are you heating up your environment? And I realize that there are dry saunas, there are steam saunas, there are infrared saunas, there are hot tubs, and there are simply rooms that you crank up the heat, okay? There are also ways in which you can increase your shell and your core temperature by moving around a lot and doing that wearing a lot of clothing. There's nothing special about any one of these approaches or protocols. It just so happens that sauna is one of the more convenient ways to do this. The temperature range is important. You want to get between 80 and 100 degrees Celsius. You could, however, immerse yourself in a hot tub or hot water bath up to your neck. That's another way to approach it. If you didn't have access to either of those, you could also put on a hoodie or a wool hat and a hoodie, or you could do like the wrestlers do, and you could actually buy one of these plastic suits. They're literally called plastics that wrestlers or other athletes that wish to drop water weight will wear and then go jogging in that. All of those will increase your shell and your core body temperature, right? Especially if you do it on a hot day. But of course, be careful, hydrate, and don't overheat. Don't become excessively hyperthermic because you can get heat stroke and you can potentially die. And of course, you have to ask yourself, wet sauna, dry sauna. You know what? Doesn't matter. Use what you prefer. Many people ask me, well, what about infrared sauna? It does have certain benefits for skin and other organs and tissues of the body if used properly. My understanding, or at least my assessment of most infrared saunas out there, is that they don't get hot enough. They don't get up to that 80 to 100 degrees Celsius range. Some do, most don't. I personally am of the stance, based on the literature that I've read, that you want to get into those ranges of 80 to 100 degrees Celsius before you start considering whether or not you're also going to include red light therapies, etc. So there's nothing special about red light sauna. It's really the temperature of the sauna that you happen to get into. So what happens when you get into a hot environment? What are the mechanisms that allow for the various health effects of that? Well, your shell, your skin, senses that, and through the circuit that I described earlier, activates neurons in the POA, the preoptic area, which in turn activates mechanisms in your autonomic nervous system like vasodilation. So blood flow increases, plasma volume of your blood increases, and stroke volume. The volume of blood that is mobilized with each beat of your heart also increases. And your heart rate increases to anywhere between 100 to 150 beats per minute. That general constellation of effects looks a lot like cardiovascular exercise. And in fact, for all intents and purposes, it really is cardiovascular exercise, except that there isn't the mobilization and the loading of joints and limbs and things of that sort. And of course, there are additional benefits of cardiovascular exercise that relate to impact on the ground, improvements in bone density, et cetera, et cetera. Your vasculature changes shape literally to accommodate those increases in heart rate and blood volume. And you're basically getting a cardiovascular workout in that hot environment, even if you're just sitting down. Shifts in the output of hormones, both from your adrenals and possibly from the testes and ovaries, and even within the brain. One of the more striking examples of that comes from a study that was published in 2021. The title of the study is Endocrine Effects of Repeated Hot Thermal Stress and Cold Water Immersion in Young Adult Men. They had these men attend 4 sauna sessions of 12 minutes each. So again, well within that range of 5 to 20 minutes, 12 minutes. The temperature of those saunas was 90 to 91 degrees Celsius. So I'll just quickly do the calculation, admittedly not in my head. That's 194 degrees Fahrenheit. Afterwards, they had a 6-minute cool down break, during which they did get into some cool water or cold water of about 10 degrees. And then they measured hormones at various times throughout this study, before, during, and after. They looked at testosterone, they looked at DHEA, which is in the androgen pathway, they looked at prolactin, and they looked at cortisol. The major effect of this study is a significant decrease in cortisol output in these subjects. I think this is really interesting and important because many people suffer from acute, meaning immediate, and long-term stress and are looking for ways to control their stress. Controlling your cortisol is tricky, but many people are overworked. They're overstressed. For one reason or another, they're subjected to too many stressors, or their level of stress resilience isn't high enough to keep their cortisol levels clamped at a healthy level. So the protocol I described of 12-minute exposures to 90-degree environment, that's again 90 degrees Celsius, followed by a 6-minute cool down break in cool water, 50 degrees or so. That's pretty cold. I can imagine that you could also just take a cool shower or a cold shower afterwards. That had a very significant effect on lowering cortisol. So there you have a tool. It's not a completely zero-cost tool because you need to heat the water. You need to have access to hot and cold water, at least hot and cold contrast of some sort. One of the more dramatic and important effects of going into a hot environment for some period of time is the activation of so-called heat shock proteins, or HSPs. Heat shock proteins are a protective mechanism in your brain and body to rescue proteins that would otherwise misfold. When your body goes through changes in temperature in response to hot environments or cold environments, heat shock proteins are deployed to go and rescue and prevent the changes in proteins that would be detrimental to your health. So at least in the short term, activating heat shock proteins is a good thing. You don't want heat shock proteins to be activated for long periods of time because that gets to be problematic for other reasons. It's well established in animal models and in humans that sauna exposure of the sort that I described earlier activates these heat shock proteins. However, there have been interesting studies done in humans examining some of the downstream molecular pathways of deliberate heat exposure that point to the mechanisms by which deliberate heat exposure can help protect against different forms of mortality, improve health overall, and possibly, and I want to highlight possibly extend life. One such mechanism involves a genetic program involving a molecule called FOXO3. FOXO3 is a very interesting molecule because it's involved in DNA repair pathways. DNA repair is part of the process of remaining healthy. You know, we'd all like to think that we're born and based on the genes we have, we are healthy, then eventually we age and then we die. But from the time we're born until the time we die, there's a constant repair of our proteins and our cells and a modification of the genes that are being expressed. You know, puberty being the most dramatic example, right? You see a kid before puberty and after puberty, looks like a different kid, sounds like a different kid, thinks like a different kid. In fact, basically is a different human being, right? It's not just the hormones, it's that hormones themselves have the capacity to turn on and turn off certain genes, literally converting certain tissues and cells in the brain and body to do entirely different things. Throughout our entire lifespan, genes are being turned on, genes are being turned off. Genes are being turned on, genes are being turned off, and DNA, the stuff of genes, gets damaged in that process. FOXO3 sits upstream in a pathway related to DNA repair and, again, clearing of these senescent cells. Sauna exposure, in particular sauna exposure 2 to 3 times or ideally 4 to 7 times per week in that 80 to 100 degree Celsius range, has been shown to upregulate levels of FOXO3. FOXO3, in turn, upregulates pathways related to DNA repair and clearing out of these senescent or dead cells, which is known to be important for various aspects of maintaining cognition and other aspects of maintaining health. One of the more dramatic and important effects of going into a hot environment for some period of time is the activation of so-called heat shock proteins, or HSPs. Heat shock proteins are a protective mechanism in your brain and body to rescue proteins that would otherwise misfold. When your body goes through changes in temperature in response to hot environments or cold environments, heat shock proteins are deployed to go and rescue and prevent the changes in proteins that would be detrimental to your health. So at least in the short term, activating heat shock proteins is a good thing. You don't want heat shock proteins to be activated for long periods of time because that gets to be problematic for other reasons. It's well established in animal models and in humans that sauna exposure of the sort that I described earlier activates these heat shock proteins. However, there have been interesting studies done in humans examining some of the downstream molecular pathways of deliberate heat exposure that point to the mechanisms by which deliberate heat exposure can help protect against different forms of mortality, improve health overall, and possibly, and I want to highlight possibly extend life. One such mechanism involves a genetic program involving a molecule called FOXO3. FOXO3 is a very interesting molecule because it's involved in DNA repair pathways. DNA repair is part of the process of remaining healthy. You know, we'd all like to think that we're born and based on the genes we have, we are healthy, then eventually we age and then we die. But from the time we're born until the time we die, there's a constant repair of our proteins and our cells and a modification of the genes that are being expressed. You know, puberty being the most dramatic example, right? You see a kid before puberty and after puberty, looks like a different kid, sounds like a different kid, thinks like a different kid. In fact, basically is a different human being, right? It's not just the hormones, it's that hormones themselves have the capacity to turn on and turn off certain genes, literally converting certain tissues and cells in the brain and body to do entirely different things. Throughout our entire lifespan, genes are being turned on, genes are being turned off. Genes are being turned on, genes are being turned off, and DNA, the stuff of genes, gets damaged in that process. FOXO3 sits upstream in a pathway related to DNA repair and, again, clearing of these senescent cells. Sauna exposure, in particular sauna exposure 2 to 3 times or ideally 4 to 7 times per week in that 80 to 100 degree Celsius range, has been shown to upregulate levels of FOXO3. FOXO3, in turn, upregulates pathways related to DNA repair and clearing out of these senescent or dead cells, which is known to be important for various aspects of maintaining cognition and other aspects of maintaining health. Growth hormone is a hormone that we all naturally secrete from our pituitary, which also resides near the roof of our mouth. The signal for the pituitary to release growth hormone arrives from neurons that exist in the hypothalamus, and then growth hormone impacts metabolism and growth of cells and tissues of the body. It is responsible for tissue repair as well, and the growth spurt that everyone experiences during puberty is the consequence of growth hormone. As all of us age, when we go from adolescence to our teenage years and then into young adulthood, but then starting in our early 30s or so, the amount of growth hormone that we secrete is greatly diminished. Normally, we would release growth hormone every night. low blood sugar, turns out, is a stimulus for growth hormone release. And I don't mean hypoglycemia of the sort that makes you dizzy and want to pass out. That's bad. I mean not having high levels of glucose and insulin in your bloodstream. This is one of the reasons why many people are drawn to intermittent fasting or even prolonged fasting. It's because of the reported increases in growth hormone. Certain forms of exercise have also been shown to stimulate growth hormone release, which for people in their 30s, 40s, and beyond could be very useful and may also be useful for people who are just trying to stimulate the release of more growth hormone in order to, for instance, recover from exercise or stimulate fat loss or muscle growth or repair of a particular injury. So let me describe what they did in this study. They used an 80 degrees Celsius environment, so that's 176 degrees Fahrenheit, and they had subjects do this sauna for 30 minutes 4 times per day. So that's 2 hours total in one day. 30 minutes in the sauna, a period of cool down rest, 30 minutes in the sauna again, cool down rest, a third and a fourth time. So they had subjects do this protocol. And I should mention they had both male and female subjects in this study. And the entire study lasted a week. They did this 2 hours of sauna exposure on day 1, day 3, and day 7 of that week. And they measured a lot of different hormones: cortisol, thyroid stimulating hormone, thyroid hormone itself, luteinizing hormone, and follicle stimulating hormone, which are hormones that essentially drive the production of other hormones. They looked at prolactin and they looked at growth hormone. In subjects that did this 2 hour a day, 80 degree Celsius protocol, experienced 16-fold increases in growth hormone. So they measured growth hormone before the sauna and after the sauna, and growth hormone levels went up 16-fold, which is obviously an enormous and, it turns out, statistically significant effect. The effects of sauna exposure on growth hormone actually went down the more often that people did this deliberate heat exposure. On day 1, there was a 16-fold increase in growth hormone. On day 3, however, there was still a significant effect on growth hormone as compared to before sauna. Okay, so now instead of getting a 16-fold increase, it was more like a 3 or 4-fold increase, which is still a huge increase, but not as great as the increase observed on day 1. And then on day 7, there tended to be a 2, maybe a 3-fold increase. The reason this happens is because heat, just like cold, is a shock or a stressor to the system. In the context of cold, if you get into a very cold ice bath, for instance, a 5-degree ice bath, even for 20 seconds, it's known to increase norepinephrine 200%. It can double the amount of norepinephrine that you suddenly release into your brain and body, which actually can have some positive effect. But if you were to do that every day, you would become cold adapted. This circuit that compares the shell and core of your body would adjust in ways that it could either predict that cold stimulus or, more likely, to create some thermogenic mechanisms in preparation for that cold exposure. But the fact that that result diminished over time either means that the circuit was not as efficient in communicating that shift in temperature, or that that shift in temperature was of less impact because the downstream effectors were not engaged to the same extent because it wasn't as much of a shock. And I think the latter explanation is far more likely.